Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. I'm Nathaniel, or as you may know me by now as the Whisky Speaker. Now today I'm trying out my new iPad, so I'm really excited about this. This has come about because of the growing interest that you guys, girls and all the good people out in the world there have in learning about whiskey. And today, because of that, I can increase my budget, hence a new gizmo in which to record. So we're going to be talking about Peat, and I'm not talking about your good mate Peat necessarily if you have one, who's a pub quiz maestro. Get my words out and that might help. We are going to be talking about Peat as in the stuff that's a little bit old, and when I mean old, I'm talking about 10,000 years old. Now, if we rewind the clock back to 11,500 years ago, the Great Ice Age, which covered most of the Northern Hemisphere and all the Earth on that, obviously Canada's, the islands, the UK, etc., Iceland, all of that, you know, all of these Northern Hemisphere places, when the ice and snow actually retracted, what it left behind about roughly just over 10,000 years ago was peat bogs, and peat bogs are mosses and grasses and cottonseed that over time in a highly acidic waterbed as biomatter is basically crushed down and decomposed. We can do it today obviously with grass trimmings. If we kind of cut our lawn and get that lovely fresh smell of cut grass and then put it into a composter, we get exactly the same result, where heat, weight and pressure crush it and compact it, leaves obviously a rich, nourished material to be used as kind of like a fertilizer for soils. But peat is exactly this: decomposed moss, grasses and seeds over 10,000 years old. And during that time, it doesn't actually break down very quickly. You are talking about only a millimole in height mass on an active peat bed per year is added. So it's not a sustainable place to kind of cut your fuel source. Why would I say fuel source? Well, because if you go back even before distilleries, in Scotland and in Ireland, when you had crofts out in kind of very remote moors, you know, where you imagine the kind of very romantic heather and stags roaming and people living on the land, you know, this fuel source of peat was in abundance, and for the crofters it was a godsend. So they would cut it using a peat cutter. That is the actual name, very original name. I like it. I like something when it says what it says and what it means to do on the tin, and this is no mistake. They would cut their peat and cut it into bricks, which would then be put onto the side on the grass and then kind of just be allowed to air dry anywhere traditionally up to 3 months. And what that would do is that would draw out all the moisture, so the brick that was of a large size over time would shrink and contract as the moisture was drawn out of it. And then that was perfect, easy fuel source to be put onto the fire to keep obviously the cabin, or as I should say, the croft and cottages warm. Illicit distillers and then later legal distillers also found that the peat is brilliant because what it does is it actually creates a great amount of smoke which dries, and when they're doing that in the maltings with the traditional iconic pagoda roofs, the copper angled roofs with the slats for the vent of all the smoke billowing out, that kind of quintessential what we imagine Scottish distilleries and indeed Irish distilleries to have as like a point of reference. That is where all the smoke would be absorbed into the grain would draw that in and then kind of retain it, and that would then become phenolic content, or measured as parts per million. Now if you put the two cereals to side by side, unsmoked and smoked, you will see that there is a difference, as in that the actual seed itself is darker in colour if it has been smoked. Smoking, with what you're trying to aim for, is not heat, because you don't want to damage the seed. You don't want to damage the enzyme, making and breaking down the walls to gain access to the starch and sugars. But you just wanted to kind of terminate the germination process, and peat does that very well. So it's more about the smoke than it is the heat, although peat can give out a tremendous amount of heat. That then goes through a distillery, whether it more traditionally copper pot stilled or less than column still, because column still you're trying to create a light bodied grain neutral spirit, i.e. like less esters and less kind of characteristics and just a plain body of alcohol, whereas copper pot still ideal for using peated whiskey. Not exclusively, but you can associate peated whiskey with the region of Islay, off the west coast of mainland Scotland, and that is like the kingpin. If you want to think about it, you're talking about the Ardbeg supernovas. You're talking about, or Bruce Laddick's Octomore, which can have a parts per million ppm phenolic content from 100 to 300. You're talking off the scale. Just, you know, I try and actually avoid the kind of opinionated element of it, because whether you're a newbie, whether you're intermediate, whether you're kind of full guns blazing, you know what you're doing and what you want out of whiskey. Probably trying these intense whiskies may be something that you build up to and have the fun of building up to, and start with lighter bodied whiskies. But you know, they are there and they are wonderful things to try. But if you take peat from Islay, you will get kind of more briny medicinal notes out of it, and that is because of the type of moss and the sea around it. That's kind of, the wind is blowing the air onto all the kind of short grasses, whereas in the Highlands, you know, you'll get a kind of more heavy, meatier bacon smoke when you use that on the malted barley process, and that's because of the decomposition of not only the moss that was left behind, but because of the ancient woodlands that were on top of the moss that have been kind of broken down into the peat beds over time. So depending on where you are in the world, whatever peat you use will actually dictate a different flavour, which is fascinating. Peat itself is added, actually I'm jumping the gun a little bit. So if you look at this, not the best example, but Glenwivis, and I'm not saying that Glenwivis is not a good whiskey, but just for the purpose of new make spirit, this is cask filling strength 63.5%. You'll notice that obviously when it gets fermented, or goes through the mash tun and then through the fermenter and then through the still, the only part at which you can tell that there's actually been smoke added from peat into the barley is through the nose. The colour, it's all stripped out, and there's not really a suggestion that even though the grain was darker when it came out of the maltings, that it necessarily would carry through as a darker wash, or that, you know, it goes in as a dark solution into the stills, but it's there on the nose. And it's completely stripped at that point, obviously becoming low wines then into the spirit rum before going into the barrel. But the nose of it, it remains true, and it remains there very noticeably. So where does peat actually come into the process? Well, apart from the maltings, which is like the key factor, I'm just going to say here, then the malting process of the barley absorbing the smoke from the kilning process of stopping germination, that pretty much is the essence of it. Then once it goes through that process, depending on whether in the mash tun they're using water that's come from across moors, across the gorse and the peat bed again, you know, parts of peat can be detected in the water, but there's not necessarily a known contributing factor to flavour at this point. And then it all gets colour wise, as we said, gets stripped out all the way through to going into the barrel. And traditionally, as we know, in maybe Ireland and in Scotland, the the flavours, the tannins, the vanillins, and all that coming out of fresh, predominantly bourbon, white oak barrels, they're not, traditionally speaking, going to have had much in the way of peat in them. But if you put a peated whiskey, a Scotch whiskey, into a barrel that was even virgin oak or a first fill bourbon, and then you degorge it and get rid of that content, and then put some new make spirit from a different distillery, like let's say like Glenwivis, if you used to do that, the actual phenolic content from the previous whiskey will soak into that new make spirit, as the barrel has kind of expanded during the summer. So the whiskey new make spirit, as it's maturing, has forced its way into the grain or into the carbon of the char, and then has kind of been drawn back out. When it gets cold, it contracts and it draws that back out into the spirit. So that's when you're kind of, even a non-peated whiskey will become peated. So that's like a hint of peat, a wisp if you want to call it that. So from there, that's where all the peat can enter the process, not just the malting of the barley, but it can enter it at several different stages along the run, or the spirit run. So to give you an idea, because I think people always like to see a reference, an actual true reference, Turab Haig from the Island of Skye. This is part of the Legacy series. This was their second one that they ever did. As you can see, it's pretty light as well, and peat hasn't necessarily played a part in the colouring of this at all, because from the new make spirit, it's just white. But if you just quickly read on the back of the label, it does say there, heavily peated single malt with a mix of Concerto and Laureate's malted barley with a grain phenolic content of 77 parts per million. So that's a heavy, that is quite a heavy whiskey for smoked or peat heads, as I referred to earlier. As a side note, just finishing up, well, I think what we have to be careful of is that in future, don't get me wrong, I love a peated whiskey, but as we become more environmentally aware of the fact of the environment and carbon footprints, peat actually is a very good retainer of carbon dioxide, like a tree, almost like a lung. It breathes it in, it holds it and retains it. And when we cut it, we do release the CO2, and then on turn that gets burnt into peat, into the barley, and then that barley then gets used in the distillation process, and then the bottle then gets transported to the final consumer. So that's all an increase on the carbon footprint. And so it wouldn't surprise me that in time, if, I don't think it will die out completely, and I'm not bashing peat at all, peated whiskies, but it's something that I think a lot of distilleries may in time become aware of, just because it's not a sustainable source of fuel, and because it needs to be conserved because of the biodiversity it kind of retains within it, and it creates. And so things, you're talking probably hundreds of years, but peated whiskies may become indeed a delicacy in time. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really do appreciate you taking the time to join me. I will hopefully have for you another subject soon that will kind of tickle and tantalise the world of whiskey. And as ever, if you have any questions or any thoughts on anything I've raised, please do drop us a message in the box below, and I will love to respond to you. In the meantime, guys, keep safe and well, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. Bye for now.